Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So it is my privilege this morning to introduce our Bible study facilitator. And so the Reverend Jeannie Alexander is the director of No Exceptions Prison Collective, a legal and educational advocacy organization with and on behalf of prisoners and their families. No Exceptions works through a combination of litigation, legislation, and grassroots movements, building a collaboration with prisoners, free world individuals, houses of worship, and other like-minded organizations. No Exceptions' primary focus areas are sentencing, reform, and internal prison conditions. Jeannie is also a co-founding resident of Harriet Tubman House, an interfaith community dedicated to restorative practices in earth stewardship and human rights. She serves as the head chaplain at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution for 3 years until September 2014. Prior to that, she was the volunteer chaplain for 2 years. As chaplain, she facilitated the creation of an unprecedented number of programs for insiders, both in minimum security and on death row, and developed interfaith communities in prison based on a model of liberation theology. She has been a professor of philosophy, ethics, and religion. Jeannie is a writer with essays published in the book and the Criminals with Him. And she has 2 forthcoming books of poetry titled Folklore, and an examination of faith, life sentences, and the cultural and moral cost of caging humans for life, titled Redemption. She has blogged for Tokens and written for Bitter Southern. She has interviewed lectures and preaches frequently on the topics of mass incarceration and slavery, alternatives to prison, Christian anarchism, and transformative justice. She holds a JD from Cornell Law and a master's in religious studies with a focus on Christian ethics and mysticism. She is also a lover of bees, bogs, and all things wild. Amen. Congregation, receive Jeannie Alexander by the word amen.
Amen.
Thank you. I'm going to put everything. I'm good. Yeah. I've got my phone so I can keep an eye on time, because once I start talking, sometimes it's very hard to stop. I'll be mindful of that.
Can you go go full hour, I would say. And then
You sure? Okay, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Okay, and if it makes sense to break at the 9:15 like we were, we can do that, because I've got this sort of divided into 2 really clear halves. And so we
Okay,
can
so
do
why
that.
don't you, we'll go with your lead.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate this opportunity. When Preston began talking to me about your organization a couple of years ago and trying to recruit me, he said Rene Girard. I'm like, oh God, I haven't read Rene Girard since grad school. And I'm like, well, I don't know. And I felt like I had a million things going on, and he's been persistent. Because he is. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So I think what we're going to do is proceed like this. We're going to read the text first. Then I want to talk about Girard
Do you want me to pass those out?
specifically. Those I'm going to wait. Okay. That's for the second half, and I'm going to take this off now. Specifically talk about Girard's work and thoughts as it concerns scapegoats. Goats, I can't speak. Because I'm going to look at the reading today, through the lens of mass incarceration, our prison industrial complex, carceral slavery. So that is the lens that I'm going to be using today. We'll go back to our reading again. And I'm kind of glad that you don't have it in front of you, because what I really want to do for the second time that I read it is sort of have you all practice sort of a light version of Ignatian prayer. Are you guys familiar with that, right? So one of the wonderful things about Ignatian prayer is that you're putting yourself in that reading. And so I'll ask that both times that I read, we just be silent, and if you want, close your eyes, but be somewhere else. Be immediately present with that gospel. And then we'll deconstruct the reading a little bit through that lens of the prison industrial complex. We'll break and we'll come back, and scapegoats will speak. So that is going to be the perspective of very concrete, real examples and individuals and narratives today. So let me start with the reading. So the reading comes from Mark 5, 1 through 20. The Gerasene Demoniac. They came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him anymore, even with the chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains. And the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. And no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, day and night, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains and gashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine, so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine. And the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and 2,000 of them were drowned in the sea. Their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine, and they began to implore him to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him, but said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. So there is an essay, it's part of a book, and of course it's written by Girard, about scapegoats and scapegoating. And you will have a copy of that before the end of today. I want to make sure that you can take that with you so that you can think about this on your own and explore it. And so, unfortunately, sort of the first half of this is going to be a little more lecture, but please interrupt. It's not interrupt. Please, just let me know if you have questions. But Girard has some incredibly important things to say about scapegoating that are as relevant today, probably more so, even than when those words were written. And scapegoating in this praxis was part of a much older ritual, which was very clear. And we get a description of it from Leviticus, wherein the priest would lay his hands on the goat and send that goat out into exile, and would transfer the sins of the community onto the scapegoat. Now that praxis comes from an older Greek praxis of pharmakos. And when Girard is talking about the Jewish practice of sending the sins of the community into the goat and sending that out, he notes that this Greek practice of pharmakosis was considered far more barbaric, because at least a goat wasn't a human. And so with pharmakosis, what would happen is if some great disaster happened or tragedy occurred in a community, a person who was a slave or crippled in some way or a criminal would be chosen to bear the sins, to bear whatever it was that had caused the anger of the gods, and that individual would be sacrificed. And so Rene is writing and thinking about scapegoating through that lens. And based on Rene's analysis, which we'll get, Girard's analysis, which we'll get deeper into in a moment, I want to give you my proposition for this whole study. And that is that I have become increasingly more convinced that Christianity is teleologically incomplete, that it is not finished. Because I think that Christianity is far more a praxis than a belief system. And one of the things that Girard is going to propose is that we really don't want to claim to have scapegoats today, that we don't need them, and that they aren't brutal, and that what we'll do is we will other people, and they will become the scapegoats. But we really have gotten away from this more primitive, ritualistic sort of choosing them and sending them out into the wilderness. And I think that that is absolutely incorrect. So there are things that I agree with Girard about. I agree with him about the fact, and we'll talk about how there is a catharsis which takes place when we can identify a scapegoat, when we can put our sins onto another, and through that catharsis we think we have some form of purification, but it will never work, and it will always fail us as a culture, which is why we keep repeating this over and over. I was raised early on in a Southern Baptist church, and there are beautiful things about the Baptist faith tradition that I love. I teach here at ABC. I did not maintain that as my faith tradition, and one of the things that I found dissatisfying about it, even at a young age, was this idea that everything has been completed in the crucifixion and the resurrection. There is nothing else that needs to be done. And it seemed far more faith and belief driven and not so much in the praxis. And I know that that is wildly different in different churches. But at a young age, it left me very uncomfortable and thinking, this is not what Jesus was talking about. This is not, we aren't done. It's not enough to simply pray. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what Girard has to say about scapegoats. He says that as Christianity spreads, that there are mystical systems that decay and that sacrificial rites disappear. And that's one of the hallmarks of Christianity and the spread of it, that we have eliminated these sacrificial rites, that we don't do these primitive things anymore. What I'm going to propose today is that they absolutely have not disappeared. That it seems that we cling to our sacrifices more today than we ever have. And this is why I am proposing that our belief is teleologically incomplete. So if you'll permit me for a minute, you heard some of my background is in the study of mysticism. So there's this concept, right, of sacred time and sacred space, where literally time and location and space is suspended. And there are certain events in history where that sacred time and space is created. Now, I believe that all of life is sacred, and the ground we stand on is sacred, but there are these punctuated events. So, for example, in Islam, one of the reasons it's so important to read the Quran in Arabic, and why the Quran becomes so important, which is something that Westerners and Christians often don't understand. They're like, oh, you're worshiping this book. It's so important because from the Muslim perspective, when you read from the Quran in its native tongue, that moment is a created sacred time and sacred space. So you are immediately present at the inception of that revelation, right? And what I would propose is that the crucifixion, the state execution of Jesus, was another one of those moments of sacred time and sacred space. And we aren't invited just into resurrection and to practice resurrection, but to really understand that, we are also invited into crucifixion. And for that crucifixion to be complete, right, for Jesus to serve as that last sacrifice, the Lamb of God, I think requires praxis on our part. And I know I'm seeing some faces, I'm like, this girl is out there. But hang with me for a minute, right? Because I think we are invited to participate in the kingdom of God, right? The kingdom of God is within us. But we have to make that happen, and that comes through praxis. And if our belief system were teleologically complete, we would not continue to have scapegoats. We would not still require sacrifices. And I don't mean just metaphorical sacrifices. I mean blood sacrifices. This is a culture of blood sacrifice and worship of war, which protects and continues an unbroken line of an institution of slavery from chattel slavery to carceral slavery today. We are a blood culture. And so, as someone who is a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, I understand the perpetuation of this blood culture and sacrifice and war to mean there is work to be done. We are still called to participate. And so that is what I mean when I say I believe that Christianity is teleologically incomplete. The kingdom is right here. And we don't have the courage to birth it yet. We work for this every day, but it has not. It is here in moments and punctuated events, but then we lose it so easily. And we do that out of fear. Now, when Girard talks about scapegoating, and he talks about how it is less sinister than pharmacosis, right, than this exact human ritual of sacrifice, he says it's because, again, that the sacrifice is never a human being. But today, I would say, we aren't just practicing scapegoating, we are still practicing pharmacosis. And if we can't tolerate the sacrificial victim, the scapegoat, to be a human being, right? Because most of us are not laying hands on our goats and like ritually slaughtering goats or sending them out. But if we can't stand for it to be not a human being, we are deeply invested and engaged in the process of dehumanizing. So our sacrificial victims could permissibly be human if in fact they weren't human. They were something less than, which again has been a hallmark of this American experiment in our culture. I mean, very recently we were reminded again, right, in the news, these people aren't even human. These people are animals. And whether or not Trump was talking about MS-13 specifically, and I will tell you I've known members of MS-13 and have been in rooms alone with members of MS-13 unshackled. And regardless of what a person has done, they are still human. You are never less than human. So whether he was talking about that or immigrants more broadly, there's still the scapegoating at our highest levels. Sorry. So when Girard talks about the transferring of transgressions onto the goat and how that's not a human now, from the Jewish perspective, he said that it was okay to do it to goats, right? And in part it was probably okay, historically speaking, because think about a goat. They have bad reputations. I kind of like goats, but he says they had bad reputations, a nauseating odor, and an aggressive sexual drive. So if it has a bad reputation, a nauseating odor, and a suggested aggressive sexual drive, then you can hardly have sympathy. Most of the men that I spent years working with on the inside had very bad reputations. Many were rendered infamous with their judgment. Prisons are places of confinement, places of fear. So there are places in particular on maximum size and maximum security where solitary confinement is practiced in this state every single day, in most states every single day. And there is an odor to prison. Violence has a smell. Fear has a smell. There's a lack of fresh air. And then aggressive sexual drives, tendencies toward violence. We use a lot of justifications to keep people in the tombs. And I promise you we're coming back to the gospel reading. We're going to connect Girard to that. And Girard further says that when we're talking about the primitive and archaic world, he said these rituals of expulsion are due to enormous cynicism and childish naivety. So we have these rituals in archaic worlds, right? Maybe not in the modern world, but again, you can look at enormous cynicism and childish naivety. I think we live in a very cynical world. And I think that the system depends on a certain level of naivety on the part of the population. Our culture is addicted to crime shows, right? I mean, just think about television and how many of the shows that are currently on TV have to do with crime, right? It's constant. We're also addicted to reality television. And there seems to be this heightened addiction to and need to see what I call, and some of my collective members on the inside refer to as prison porn, like this crazy reality television that takes place inside of a prison, which always essentializes and follows one or two different tropes, right? The good kid that got into trouble with drugs, the person who asserts their innocence but maybe or maybe isn't, and then the monster that can never be freed, right? These really bad guys, really scary people. And we essentialize, right? Crime dramas, our legal system, encourages us to think in single-person narratives and very black and white situations, which is exactly what you need in order to maintain a system of retribution. And a system of retribution is a system that is primed for sacrifice. He says that those in ancient times who participated in ritual appreciated them so much that they would replicate them without shame, transferring sins from the community to the victim. And it seemed to them to be beyond their direct participation. And so while they craved that sacrifice, they weren't directly responsible, but could feel good about the sacrifice because they were part of purifying the culture and keeping society clean. He says, Girard goes on to say that in the modern world, violence is no longer subject to ritual, and it's strictly prohibited, and anger cannot satisfy its appetite on the object responsible for anger. Thank you. Do you mind passing? Thank you. And this is the essay from Girard, so I would ask that later, if you would take the time to read it and contemplate what we're discussing here today, that would be great. I want to go back and repeat that. Girard says that in the modern world, violence is no longer subject to ritual. It is strictly prohibited, and anger cannot satisfy its appetite on the object responsible for anger. Except, I would say, when we are talking about system violence. The violence of the system is not only not prohibited, it is encouraged. And instead, the state stands in the shoes of the one who has been harmed, the one who's been wronged, the one who is angry, the one who has been violated. And so now, we seek catharsis through system violence. So I would say we absolutely have not prohibited violence. We have simply justified it. It has become canon. It has become law. The circumstances. Let's talk a little bit about what that system violence looks like, right? And a system of retribution where the state stands in the shoes of one who is wrong. There is no participation by a victim. So for those of you who maybe participate in or work in an area of restorative justice in your own communities, you know that restorative justice actually came out of a victim's rights, a victim's healing movement, right? Because to take control, when the state stands in the shoes of the victim is only utilized at that point to supply a narrative, right? To justify what we will talk about later as being a scapegoat and a sacrifice. Because what I'm going to argue is that even if someone is absolutely guilty of what they have been convicted of, there is still scapegoating. In part because we are hyper obsessed with the bad guys, right? With the criminals. And once someone has been labeled a criminal based on an action, often on the worst day of their life, then you can justify doing anything. And it's far easier not to create a just society. It's far easier not to turn our economic system upside down. It is far easier not to deal with our social sins of systemic racism, white supremacy, poverty, our bloodlust for war, and instead, if we can say this concrete human, this concrete object, this is the problem, right? And exile or kill that problem. That's a lot easier for our system than saying, wait a minute, taking a step back and trying to think about this restoratively. Why does this happen? Why does crime occur? You know? And the work that I do, language matters everywhere, but the terminology victim and offender is so slippery. One of the things that I learned in my 5 years inside a men's maximum security prison is that every person I met in there who was an offender, who had been convicted of a violent offense, had first been a victim long before they had been an offender. And as I began to explore that, and victimized through violence, victimized through sexual abuse. And I want to say that was one of the things, and I don't know why, when I went to work in a men's prison, I expected folks to have a background of physical abuse and violence. I expected to find that. I did not expect to find the incredibly high rates of sexual abuse as children. I would say it was probably close to 60% of some of the folks I was working with, particularly, again, with violent offenders. And I'll spend probably a little more time today focusing on so-called violent offenders than nonviolent, because that is the example we think of where that's, okay, the most acceptable scapegoat to use. So we'll be talking about that. But it was, and so not only are those terms slippery, right? If we could acknowledge them, and if we could acknowledge that humans are far more complex than moments and actions, and that if we were seeking healing instead of quick so-called solutions of scapegoating, you would have to consider the entire community and a history of a person. There's a concept in criminal law of mitigation, where you have to consider the circumstances, perhaps a person's circumstances, and you should look at the factors that led to the crime. And what I can tell you is that's basically absent in the South. We pay lip service to mitigation, but I've worked with individuals one case after another. Oh, sure. One case after another, where, for example, an individual, it was clear, was severely mentally ill at the time and spent years. We will take and send someone to a mental hospital for years. So one person I'm thinking of was there for 3 years until they could get well enough to stand trial. Right? On death row, right? Medical care inside all prisons is really pretty terrible. People who say, oh, you get 3 hots and a cot and free medical care, it's a great place. No, it's a great place to go die. But in death row, still, medical care. You want to ensure that people stay alive long enough to kill them. These sacrificial goats are so important that every part of the process must be maintained and controlled. With lethal injection, which is what this state has practiced in its executions. And unfortunately, the state legislature just enabled the state to begin using the electric chair again, just in case it can't get the drugs. But during the process of lethal injection, the first thing that's done is you sanitize the area. So it doesn't even begin to look like, it looks like a clinical procedure. So it's absolute control, and it's an obfuscation of what's actually happening. Right? Okay.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
You said that Girard suggests that violence is no longer ritualized, but isn't there a liturgy to every execution? An order?
Yeah. Absolutely.
That we go through this bit of a ritual.
I think that's absolutely correct. In fact, I would say that our legal system is highly ritualized, right? That there is a liturgy to it, that it is its own religious system, right? And you can see that, too, in the amount of control that prosecutors have in the General Assembly. I've spent the past 3 legislative sessions in Tennessee at the Capitol, and there's a ritual to all of it. There are parts that are going to be played. There is a certain amount of power possessed here, a lack of power here, a judge that takes a very particular position. It is highly ritualized. That's one of the things that struck me when I was practicing law. And so yes, and even down to the execution, which is ritualized. So for example, and I wasn't even going to share this today, but while I was at the prison, before I resigned, there had been, when I was hired by a warden who was committed to programs, was far more progressive than was probably in his own best career interest in a southern prison. And I even tried to talk him out of hiring me. I never wanted to work for the state. The guys on death row were like, you've got to do this, you can bring people in, because if you bring people in, people will know we're not monsters, which is what actually convinced me to take that job in the first place. But there was, while I was there was a changing of wardens, and a real shift in culture took place in Tennessee. And this is something that we've seen replicated across the country, and that is a hyper-militarized prison environment, which goes along with our militarized police outside of that environment. And so we had a shift. It became much more militarized. It became aggressive and fearful of volunteers and programs. And it's incredibly important to have those, right? It's incredibly important, we think, to completely transform the prison environment. So we were sort of struggling with that at the same time. And part of my job there, from my perspective, was to be present should an execution occur. I will tell you this, I went into prison as a death penalty abolitionist. I came out as a prison abolitionist. But I believed it was my calling and part of my vocation to be present during an execution, so that that person being murdered by the state would have someone there with a hand on the foot or a touch to say, this is wrong, you're not alone, this is murder. And so in order to do that, I had to be present for the trial runs for execution. So in Tennessee, they practice execution.
On who?
They have mock executions. We're getting to that, usually on guards, correctional officers. But they conduct mock executions, and they do it quarterly, unless the state's killing machine ramps up and you start getting a lot of dates for executions. And then you end up doing it monthly. Now this practice is called band practice. It's a terminology they would use for it. Band practice. So when they were discussing it over the radio, they weren't talking about, well, we're going to practice our executions. It was band practice. And the way it would work is they would run through the entire execution scenario as it would actually take place were an execution occurring. And they would have someone volunteer. It was always voluntary, one of the guards, to volunteer to be the victim. And that's the language that's used. You can't make this up. So the state is practicing its killing, is saying, literally, within that practice, we need a victim. Okay. So again, the scapegoat, it's okay for us to scapegoat. It's okay for us to send people to the tombs if they've done something wrong. But even within, subconsciously, they've maintained that understanding that it's a victim. So I was present during one of these band practices during Holy Week. It was on Wednesday of Holy Week, I believe 2013. And there were 2 new wardens. And they were incredibly nervous, and I was watching them, and they were cutting up and kind of joking around within the execution chamber. They were preparing to go through this mock run, and they're kind of joking and smacking gum, and I understand that was a way to sort of release tension. but they're laughing before an execution. And so the person in charge of the execution team says, oh, we don't have a victim, we need a victim, we need a victim. They didn't have somebody selected, they hadn't checked to see who would volunteer, and I'm standing there and I said, use me. Use me. If you're going to pretend to kill someone today so that you're better at killing, 1, use a woman, and number 2, use your chaplain. So the person leading the execution team to me and said, all right, fine. The wardens didn't know what to do. They were very confused. They're like, can we do this? And so they took me back. And so the person who was awaiting the execution is taken from where they would normally live in their normal unit, and they're taken to what's called death watch. And they're placed in a cell, and they are watched constantly. Literally, it is a death watch. So I was simply taken back to that cell, closed in the cell. I had to wait for about an hour. And then when they prepare that person to take them out of the cell, you have to kneel on your bunk and place your head against the wall. And you're bent in what I could only describe as a posture of prayer. They then will put that person in full restraints, wrap them in chains, pick them up, put them on a gurney, strap them in. All this is before you get to the execution chamber. Now, one of the things I need to say about this is in my work on death row, with all the classes, with all the people we brought in from colleges and universities to run classes, to run groups, all the interaction, none of those men were ever handcuffed. None of those men were ever chained. They were free to interact with students I would bring in, with ministers, with professors. We were creating community in a place of death, and they were free to do so because the reality is they didn't present a danger. They didn't present a danger. So during the execution, you're bound in full restraints, you're put on a gurney then, you're secured to the gurney, and so then they wheeled me into the execution chamber. And it was the most uncomfortable group of people I've ever seen in my life. There was that moment. And I felt calm. Can you be calm and also freaking out? Because I kind of felt like both. But then they literally run through the entire thing. So they injected me with saline solutions. They hook you up. They roll. They call for the first drug to be administered, the second drug to be administered, and the third drug to be administered. And then the warden has to call when that person is deceased. I think I was shook for 2 days after that. But to your very important point, I think the whole thing was ritualized. I think that our culture of violence and our thirst for revenge has in many ways become our true cultural religion. Because we are so precise about our rituals. It's so important to us to maintain those rituals. Let me check my time. Am I good? Okay, I'm pretty good. All right, let me try to get through Girard. Girard says that while we haven't given up scapegoats, our belief in them is 90% spoiled. Girard says a lot of things. And I would say, based on everything we've just discussed, that is not correct. Our belief in them is not spoiled. We live in a law and order culture. We live in a law and order system. And that has become our highest value. And a law and order system depends on scapegoats. It's dependent upon a myth of fear. And here's what I mean by a myth of fear. Everyone who worked in my office as a clerk was guilty of first-degree murder. There's something, and so it was like the scariest of the scary, right? They were all minimum security, not maximum, because your security designation is dependent upon your behavior within the system. They had incredibly long sentences. The crime of murder is very particular. It's very specific to incidents, to a particular instant in time. There are issues of extreme emotion involved. And it's usually a male between the ages of 17 and 27. And one of the things we know is that people age out of violent crime. So when someone with a life sentence is paroled, and like the national average for life with parole is 25 years, they are the least likely to reoffend. They're your safest bet for parole. And yet in Tennessee, our life with parole sentence is 51 calendar years. It's a backdoor death sentence. So in this state, we have the death penalty, we have life without parole, and then life with at 51 years. We have 3 death sentences in this state. Our appetite is insatiable. And the way to perpetuate that, right, what's important in this ritual, what's important in this myth, is that the victim, using system language that I just told you about, is seen as irredeemable and a monster and someone you have to be protected from. And yet what I could tell you is that is absolutely not true. It's not based on sociological evidence or statistical analysis, and it leaves no room for redemption. So one of our primary fundamental myths that we are operating out of in our culture has no redemption available. It's a myth of damnation. Did you have a question?
No, I was just saying, sister, you are so right on.
Well, and this is where it comes to how we participate teleologically in the crucifixion and the birthing of the kingdom. It's incomplete, or we would not require sacrifices to continue. So I want to read the scripture one more time. And I want us to break. And then we come back, I want some of the scapegoats, I know, to have time to speak. And I want us to read and analyze and talk about some things. That's very ambitious for an hour, but I suspect it's possible. Okay. And again, I want to ask you to place yourself in this narrative. Imagine that you can hear the waters. Imagine what it would look like to see the hillside of tombs where people are exiled sometimes, but someone who's kept in chains, who engages in self-mutilation, that person would look like. Someone who's tortured by demons of mental illness, we would say today, with no understanding what that creates, and then that moment of healing. They came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains. And the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. And no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to implore him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission. And coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. Their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind. The very man who had had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man, and all about the swine, and they began to implore him to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him. But he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. As we break for a minute, I want you to think about the fact that when this person who has been in the tombs for who knows how long, who has clearly been exiled because people are afraid of him, who's probably clearly kept in chains because he is dangerous. He's dangerous to himself, he's dangerous to others. When Jesus heals him, the reaction is anger and fear. Anger and fear that this man had been healed. If this gospel narrative were to reflect our current criminal injustice system, once this man is in his right mind and has been healed, Jesus would then turn to him and say, "You have angered this community, and they're afraid of you." And he would bind the man up in his chains and leave him in the tomb. Okay, let's take a break.